Hey art clubbers, it's Miss T. Today we are going to make our pizza crusts. Go ahead and get your supplies ready. Out of your kit you'll need the red felt, this tan felt square. You'll also need your some polyfill, which is this cotton candy fluffy looking stuff. And from home you'll need a Sharpie and some scissors. And of course, your needle and thread. If you carefully peel the tape off your needle, you can save the tape to tape it back to the cardboard when you're done for today. Go ahead and twist off your thread. I wrapped it around my hand 3 or 4 times. Make a cut and very carefully straighten out your thread. If you need a hot dog to try and get your thread in, grab some paper, just a teensy weensy hot dog. Going to fold it like a bun. Take your thread here. I might have to fold mine in half again or down a little bit so it can fit through the eye of the needle. And then, of course, carefully thread it through. If you are really good at threading needles and you don't need a hot dog, don't feel like you have to do it this way. I just find it's easier when I'm using thicker thread like this. So you'll want to make sure that your ends of your thread are lined up, that the 2 sides of your thread are not like jumbled together. Line them up really good. Lay it flat. And then to tie your knot, this is called a gathered knot, you're going to make a loop. Here, I'll move it closer so you can see. You're going to make a loop and then take the 2 ends, pretend that they're joined together and it's just one, wrap it around and then pull back through your loop and try and tie it tight so that it's sort of towards the end of your thread. Now we got our gathered knot. Make sure your thread is not tangled. And grab your tan felt. This is going to be the pizza crust, but of course we need to make it into the shape of a pizza. So I'm going to fold it from one corner. It's okay if it's not a perfect triangle because we're going to trim everything. Now I'm going to imagine how I want my pizza slice to look. I know that the crust is kind of rounded at the top, so I'm going to draw sort of like a curved line from one side to the other, and that's going to be the top of my pizza crust. If you look at your line, you're like, I need to change it just a little bit. Go ahead and do that because you won't be able to see the Sharpie lines anyways once we sew it. If you don't have a Sharpie, you can use a regular marker or even a pencil on felt. It should show up. Then you're going to very carefully cut your felt. You're actually going to be cutting like the top and the bottom. So make sure your felt is not wrinkled, it's laying flat, so that you have the same shape on both the top part of your felt and the bottom part. Now I'm going to start to sew my pizza crust shut. I'm going to start from the bottom, and I always want to start from the back to the front and pull my thread all the way through so that the knot hits the back of my fabric. Uh-oh. That's what happens when you don't make sure your thread is untangled before you start to use it. So running stitch, we go up through the fabric, back down through the fabric, up through the fabric, and then back down through the fabric over and over again. You want to make sure that your stitches are about the same size and that the space in between the stitches is about the same size. When I'm making softies like this, I always check periodically as I sew to make sure that my fabric is staying flat, and I check to make sure it hasn't accidentally moved to a place where I don't want it to, because fabric tends to shift some as you sew. Oops, I made a mistake. I accidentally stitched through the loop of my thread, so I'm going to gently fix that. You'll also notice that I'm pulling my thread flat each time I pull it through. If you don't do that, you're going to end up with a bunch of loops, and it's easy to pull them apart or mess up. Oh, another classic mistake. And so I went up through my fabric, and then instead of going back down through my fabric, I ended up going around the outside and going back up again. Classic first time sewing mistake, no problem, we can fix it pretty easily. I can actually, with felt, stick the needle backwards through the same hole, but if that's kind of complicated for you and you don't know how to do that, just cut your needle off, pull the stitch that's wrong back out and tie it off, get some new thread and start again. No big deal. So when you're sewing, you also want to make sure that you're not pulling it too tight. You want to pull the thread tight enough to have it flat, but not too tight, because then it bunches up like that. We don't want our pizza to be all crumply. So I'm just going to pull it flat, double check that my thread is in a straight line, my stitches are more or less the same. Some of you love to do teeny tiny stitches. You do not need to do super small stitches for this project. Sometimes you might want to do that just depending on your fabric, but for this, for felt, and for the amount of thread that you have, I would do like medium size stitches like you see I'm doing. All right, so I'm running out of room. I need more thread, so I need to tie this part off. I'm going to do that carefully by wrapping my needle around the thread, pulling it through the loop I made, and then slowly pulling the knot in so that it's as close to the fabric as I possibly can make it. And of course you're going to need, don't pull it too tight because then you're going to bunch up your fabric. Then of course I need to cut off my needle. And if I need to add a few more knots just to make it super strong, I can separate the two strings and just tie them like shoelaces a few times just to make that knot bigger and a little bit stronger. Once I'm done, I'm going to want to cut off the extra thread. Don't cut too close to your knot, otherwise the knot will untie. You need to leave a bit of a tail, just a little bit, to make sure your knot stays in place. Then you're just going to get your needle, get some more thread. I wrap it around my hand maybe 3 or 4 times. Use your hot dog if you want to, or you can try just to thread your needle, whichever way works for you. Just make sure that your thread doesn't get bunched up or tangled. It's easy to do. So we're going to, just like last time, match up the ends. Make sure the thread is flat. Do our loop. Go underneath. Underneath and then pull back through for our gathered knot. Boop. And then I'm going to go ahead and make this knot a little bit bigger, just like I did the last one, by tying just a few more knots over on top of it. If you have too much left over, of course you can trim it. Just make sure to leave a tail. Then you're going to start with your running stitch. Keep going. Pull it from back to front. Then front down through the fabric to the back. Check and make sure that your stitches are pretty even. They're in a straight line. They're not too close to the edge. If it's too close, then you run the risk of it coming right out of the fabric. If you need to look at the back just to double check it. And now I'm at the top, so I've got to start sewing the top. I'm going to be looking at the back of my pizza slice quite often just to make sure that I've gotten both the front piece of fabric and the back piece of fabric and not accidentally just gone through the front. Now, you only want to sew about halfway down the top of your pizza crust. Then you're going to stop because we're going to do a trick. And I'm going to show you how to stuff your pizza crust with our polyfill. So make sure to leave, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches on the top of your pizza. Just leave it open. Make sure your knot is strong and close to the fabric. I'm going to make my knot a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger. All right, now you can see it's sort of like you almost made a little bag or something inside of your pizza crust. We're actually going to flip it inside out. So very carefully and gently push your fabric through the opening that you left so that all the stitches that we just made are now going to be inside of our pizza slice, kind of hidden. Now my pizza point is not sticking out, so I'm taking this Sharpie with the cap still on. I'm going to push the fabric gently out more so that I can have more of a point at the end. Now I'm going to smooth it out so I can see the actual shape that I just made. Now I'm going to grab my red felt. This is going to be the sauce of my pizza. It's kind of already in a triangle shape, but it's much too big. So I'm going to lay my crust on top of my sauce, grab my Sharpie, and I'm just going to make a few marks at the top so I know how much to trim off. Now you will not be able to see this, so it's okay if you use Sharpie. So now I'm going to cut. I'm going to cut down a little bit further down because I want to be able to see some of the crust on the top of my slice. I'm not going to cut in a straight line because sauce really isn't that straight. It's kind of out on a pizza like globs. So I want it to look a little bit more natural. I'm going to trim off some of those waves. Okay, here we go. I notice I don't see enough crust at the top. It's not really, oh, it fits better on this side, on this way. Okay, so I like the top, but I need to make it a narrower triangle. So now I'm just going to draw with my scissors, as Matisse would say. I'm going to trim the edges just a little bit until I can see a little bit more crust around the outside edge. There we go. I'm going to trim this back a little bit. If you're having trouble with your scissors being dull or not working very well, open them a little bit wider and use the scissor part that's closer to the handle. You got more power that way. I like the size of my sauce, so I'm going to put my sauce to the side. Now I got to grab my polyfill. Polyfill is the stuffing that we're going to use to make our pizza squishy. You can separate your polyfill pretty well just by pulling it apart. I kind of like to roll it together so it's, the little fibers stick together a little bit more when I put it in there. It will be very important for you to push your polyfill all the way into the crevices of your pie So I'm using my Sharpie to kind of poke it into the pizza point. You definitely don't want to overstuff it, but make sure you put in enough in there so that it's fluffy and there's enough polyfill that fills up the whole pizza crust. You will probably have some left over. If you do, feel free to make other softies. I've seen artists make softies out of paper as well, which those turned out pretty cool. All right, so now I've got some stuff in. I feel like I need some more. I'm going to put in some more, just a little bit more. So it's not falling out, but it's definitely filling up the sack. Now, I've got to close up that hole so it doesn't fall out, right? Got to finish my crust. I don't want to trim it. I'm going to do something that is a little bit tricky. So do you see how I folded both sides onto the inside? Folded them down so that when I look at it, the crust looks like it's like one continuous crust. If you have straight pins, this is how you would use them. You would just put them through the fabric like that and it would hold it as you sew. Unfortunately, I was not able to pass out straight pins. So if you don't have them, that's okay. You're just going to have to keep looking at your fabric, making sure it's staying in place as you're sewing. If you don't want to fold the fabric, if it's just not working or it's too tricky, you actually can just do a running stitch right across the top and that will work just fine. You don't have to do the tricky fold thing that I'm about to do. So either way, you just as long as you close the hole so your fabric, oh, look, see what happened? Uh-oh. That's not good. That means I gotta cut this off. I'm gonna use my hot dog. Sometimes I think hot dogs are better when you're using such thick thread. All right, let's try this again. Ah, much better. Okay. We're going to do the same trick. You know how to do this by now. Line up the ends. Make a loop. Take your tail, put it around the loop, and then up, back through the loop. Pull tight. Try and make the knot as close to the end as you can, but always make sure you have a little bit of tail. I'm going to make this knot a little bit stronger. Okay. So I'm going to show you a blind stitch. For a blind stitch, you're going to start in between the two pieces of fabric. So you're basically going to start your first stitch just going through the front. Then you can tuck the rest of your tail from your thread inside your pizza. So now it'll be hidden. No one can see it. Then I'm going to fix my fabric with the special fold down trick I want to try. Now this is extra tricky, not just because it's hard to hold the fabric in place, but also because you're now going through lots of different layers and having to hold it really close. So just make sure that you are careful and you're not going to poke your fingers. All right, I've got it going now. I'm going to do my running stitch. I'm going to make sure that the top looks curved like pizza crust. And for running stitch, we go from back to front, then front to back, back to front, always going through the fabric, not around. Although if you know the blanket stitch, that stitch does go around, so you're welcome to try and use that one. Take a minute to double check that your fabric hasn't moved around as you sew. You also want to make sure that you're pulling your thread tightly, tight enough so that it's flat but not too tight, so our fabric should not be bunching up. That's a lot harder to do now that we've got our polyfill inside our crust. All right, that's looking pretty good. Now for my last stitch, I'm going to do another blind stitch. I'm going to pull it through in between the two pieces of fabric. I don't have enough to do a knot with my needle on the thread, so I'm cutting it off. I don't even have enough. I really just have some tiny tails, so I'm just going to do a knot by doing several shoelace ties, and see how it's going in between the two pieces of fabric. So when I'm done, I'll be able to tuck the rest of the thread inside my pizza slice. I'll use my needle to help me. Actually, I might just be able to do it with my finger. Let's see. I'm going to trim it first. And then just kind of shove it in there till you can't see it anymore. Use my Sharpie. Boom! All right, wiggle your polyfill around so that it fills out the whole space. And now, if you want to do the next step, go ahead and rethread your needle. We are going to push some of this polyfill up to the top and stitch another line about 1 inch down from the top of our crust to get it to have that sort of 3D effect. You know how crust is sometimes a little puffy around the edges? That's what we're looking for. Now, if you would rather skip this step, you don't need to do this. I think it would look cool either with or without it, so feel free. If you do decide to do this step, make sure that you're looking every single time you push it through the fabric. Make sure you look on the back so that you know exactly where it comes out, and you keep having to kind of push some polyfill up towards the top to get it to stay in there. Keep in mind that it's harder to sew through polyfill, so you got to go slowly and carefully the entire time. It's also harder to make sure that your stitching is all the way flat but not too tight so that your fabric starts to bunch. So take your time, go slow, and see if you can stitch just one running stitch all the way across to get your crust to kind of puff out. All right, once you finish your crust, you're going to take the red piece of fabric, that's going to be our sauce, and place it on top kind of how you want it to look on your pizza slice. Because we added some polyfill, our pizza slice is actually a little skinnier now. So I'm actually going to trim my sauce just a little bit more. I'm using a Sharpie to kind of guide my cuts, but you can also just trim a little bit at a time until it's the right size for you. I'm not going to cut in straight lines, again, because sauce isn't really straight. It kind of goes onto the pizza pie and spreads out a little bit. So I'm just doing really gentle curves on my pizza slice to make it look a little bit more realistic. Keep in mind, you can always trim it, but you can't make it grow back. So just do a little bit at a time if you're unsure. Looking good? All right, we're going to stop right there. And next time, we will be cutting out toppings to go on our pizza slice.